So Bob Barnett here is not a historian by trade, but he is very accomplished in the tools of the historian's trade, and he hangs out with people who really are historians by trade. And I was reminded of that a short while ago when he invited me to come to a meeting of the Camden County Historical Society, where I was to talk about what we were doing at Burlington and why that was important. And I felt that I should start by giving a brief synopsis of the significance of Burlington, why it was historically important. And Bob interrupted me and said, "You don't have to do that, Bill. These people wrote that book." And they literally had. So some of us attended last year an affair in Galloway at the Atlantic City area meeting, dedicating an old meeting house which they had restored. And there was a brief talk, and Bob was part of that. And purely on a tangential note, began talking a little bit about the Hicksite Orthodox schism. And for me, it was one of those, wait, what? moments, because what he was talking about was not what I had ever known. And so we're really happy to have this opportunity to have Bob come and elaborate on that theme. I'm looking forward to it very much, but with the full knowledge that he may be talking to people here who have written that book, I'd like to introduce Bob. And I just, one other, it's possible that you'll be more interested in the fact that he's moving to Canada and how does one go about doing that than you are in the Orthodox-Hicksite speech, but that's for you all to figure out.
Well, thank you, Bill. By way of further introduction, just want to mention that I grew up in Willingboro, and my parents are buried at the top of Mount Holly, so I'll be going there for my Father's Day visit this afternoon. But we moved down to, after I was in school in Philadelphia, we moved down to Atlantic County, and I worked for the Federal Aviation Administration. So the first meeting I went to was Atlantic City area, which is in Haddonfield Quarter, and we've been there for 30 years. As Bill mentioned, we're heading out to Canada soon. But as I got involved in Atlantic City area friends meeting and started to dig into history, which is something I had really neglected through my engineering curriculum at Drexel, I started to realize what a special place Burlington is, Burlington and South Jersey in general, how different it is, especially from North Jersey, you know, our partners up there. So even though I grew up in Willingboro, a stone's throw from the Woolman family homes, I didn't have much knowledge about Quakerism and about the history of this area, that it was a Quaker colony that was separate from the the colony of East Jersey for about almost 30 years. Its capital was Burlington. The capital of East Jersey was Perth Amboy, and that continued in a sense after they were merged into a reunited New Jersey in 1702. For the rest of the colonial period, the government of New Jersey was divided into an East Division and a West Division. So those tribal identities, most of East Jersey was Calvinist, most of West Jersey was Quaker, at least in the controlling institutions in the beginning. So they really didn't get along that well, and we're still to this day having one state with two identities. So that's something that I dug into for research and ended up writing a lengthy article in 2016 called Bipolar State that talks about the differences between the two halves of New Jersey and why that was and why it's still the case. But today, trying to focus on the 1827 split, Bill had said earlier that it's something we don't know enough about, so I'll give you a spoiler. Don't do it. Splitting was a really bad thing. There are kind of two aspects to the split. There was one that was doctrinal. There were doctrines that one side had was continuing to try to adopt, and the other side didn't want to. But there was also the sociological split between the urban areas that were getting more educated, wealthier, and when you had educated, wealthy people kind of in control of those institutions, they spent more time thinking about theology, elaborating it and saying this is what Quakers believe. And that started to become a tool whereby people who controlled what happened could say, well, this person is kind of outside our sphere because they're not doctrinally sound, because they won't assent to these particular doctrinal points. So that's part of what happened, where the doctrinal division was used for what was essentially a rural-urban split between where the meetings were. So the rural meetings that were not as educated and focused more on the inner light as sufficient, they very much did not want to be pinned down to these doctrinal tests that some of the folks in the wealthier suburban or urban meetings were pushing. So it's called Orthodox and Hicksite, the split. And the Orthodox called themselves Orthodox. The Hicksites did not call themselves Hicksites. That was a name that was applied to them by the Orthodox. And I'll say a little bit about why. But Orthodox means right belief. And with right belief come a set of doctrinal points that define what is right belief. And it's very complex and not easy to say what all of those were, because it was complex. Now, let me put, Bill, if you could get this out to everybody, holding a microphone and doing that at the same time. What I'm passing out is a fairly elegant diagram that shows the strand of Quakerism dividing in 1827 into Orthodox and Hicksite. And then what you'll see is that the Orthodox side goes through more and more splits. So the Orthodox side splits into a Gurneyite and a Wilburite branch. And then the Gurneyite splits some more. So there are so that diagram is on the elegant side. This diagram, which is the work of a guy named Jeffrey Kaiser, and he's refined it over the years. This is the 2011 version that he did for the 350th. This is every yearly meeting, and all of it splits into other yearly meetings. So who here knows the phrase, theology divides but service unites? Who all's heard that? Show of hands. Is that new to a lot of people? Apparently it is. Theology divides, service unites. If you look on the net, it's attributed to Margaret Fell. I don't think that that's accurate. It sounds very much more like something that was said probably in the early 20th century as institutions like AFSC and other consultation committees among friends worked to heal the split. So you'll see on your elegant diagram that the two sides, Hicksite and Orthodox, they reemerge in a reunification. It's funny that's under the Friends General Conference rubric. That's not a perfect diagram. It doesn't have a lot of the dirty details about the splits, but it is a good general guide to the map of the different Quaker meetings in the U.S. or in Americas today. For the gritty details, you go here. But the split itself, why was it called Hicksite? Elias Hicks was from Long Island, and he was a campaigner for a return to some of the historic testimonies that had been defining Quakerism for most of the 1700s. What happened, along with wealth and education in Philadelphia and other major urban centers, is that the wealthy would mix with the wealthy. And so a lot of ways in which Quakers had been sort of separate from the world and distinct in their ways of doing things, how they spoke, how they dressed. And in fact, I should back up a little and talk about the periods of Quakerism that have been defined by Quaker scholars like Rufus Jones and William Braithwaite. And Al asked about George Fox. So George Fox is the guy who did more for coalescing Quakers into a community, developing a system of monthly and quarterly meetings. But the period when he was active, he was very evangelistic himself. And he was going to other communities and sort of barging in and saying where they were in error and why the ways they were developing as a Quaker community were superior. So he was an in-your-face Quaker, and there were a lot of them. There's a group called the Valiant 60, these various ministers that went out to preach the Quaker gospel around England. So it was, they call this the first period of Quakerism, where it was in a very evangelical formation stage. It was called a movement sometimes. And part of that movement was fighting against persecution against the sects that were not either Puritan or High Church of England. There had been a civil war in England, and they'd come to an agreement to restore the monarchy, but there were still these outside sects that were persecuted and thrown into jail, and you still had to be part of the Anglican Church to be, you had to pay taxes to support the ministers there and that sort of thing. So when Quakers would not adhere to those requirements, they would end up in jail. So it was in the face of this persecution that they were fighting back, they were writing petitions, they were ministering in the streets as they could. Once a measure of toleration for dissenting sects had entered in, there's kind of a period that's called the second period of Quakerism, which is Quietism, where friends kind of withdrew from the world, and they said, well, the world has its ways, but we have ours, and we're going to, in a sense, I'll use the term police because it sometimes felt like that, we're going to police ourselves as a community to become the pure community of God that we know we should be. So they would enforce their discipline of plain speech, of plain clothing, of not marrying out of the meeting. And if you violated these disciplines, you would face testimonies against you, and if you acknowledged your error and said, I'm penitent, the meeting is right, I am wrong, you would kind of be accepted back into the fold. That was kind of the way it worked. So it was the authority of those enforcing the discipline that kept that community tight, but it was at a cost. It's sometimes called the purity purges of the 1700s. A lot of people read out of meeting because they married the wrong person, because they were wanton in their ways and were singing or dancing, and they didn't acknowledge their error to the meeting, so they were disowned. So you had, through the 1700s, this close community trying not to mix with the world, trying to enforce its own. And now another part of that was the testimony against slavery. So John Woolman and others were saying, we shouldn't be holding slaves, and he worked hard to fight that. And it was ultimately successful. In 1776, it was a disownable offense now to hold people enslaved. And Woolman, not content with that, so he was saying we shouldn't even be using the products that are produced by slave labor in the West Indies, dyes and other products. So that wasn't a minority position up until the 1750s. Then it became a majority position, and it became universal with 1776 regarding slavery. The trade question and trade goods, that continued to plague Friends. So what happens after our American Revolution and the stability and the Quakers had, and the growth of Quaker businesses after the Revolution, is that you have wealthier and wealthier Quakers, and they're mixing with their wealthy associates, and they're having things like the plank against slave-produced products taken out of the discipline. That happened in New York. And also just becoming more, associating more with evangelicals that were of their class within the cities. Whereas the movement against holding people enslaved in the 1700s was within the Quaker community. You started getting wealthy abolitionist Quakers in the late 1700s now participating in abolition societies. And the leaderships of the different yearly meetings were not always on board with that kind of activity. That abolitionist activity was engaging the world, not our own community, but going out in the world and doing things that were raising conflict, and approbation. So Quaker troublemakers, so the leaderships tended to be more conservative. So Elias Hicks came to Philadelphia, and he preached against these drifts away from the good discipline that the meetings had developed over the 1700s. And he was saying that, wealth is running us too much, ostentation and fancy dress, mixing with the world in ways that were not part of our discipline. So in a sense, he thought of himself as a reformer. And up until that point, if you look at the books of discipline that developed, they really only talked about behavior. There was one chapter in the Uniform Discipline of around 1806 that said that the scriptures are valuable and the children should be taught the scriptures. But there weren't doctrinal points in our book of discipline. So we had the practice. We didn't have the faith part. And what was happening outside the Quaker community at that time too is that after our new country was developed with things like a First Amendment, abridging the right of the government to make laws regarding religion, there was, and also in a sense the the fruits of the Enlightenment, you had the concept of God as having established the world with its rules of nature, its laws of physics, its laws of biology, and letting it be. It was called deism, the idea that God is remote. It's not so much a personal God. And I'm not talking about in the Quaker community, because they always had that inner light and seeking God's will within. But I'm saying that in the world around the Quakers, there was more and more Enlightenment thinking and more less religious thinking. But then there was a huge reaction to that in the culture at large of evangelism. So you had the Second Great Awakening with a lot of revivals and Bible societies and missionary activity that was trying to correct what they saw as an imbalance. That no, there is a personal God, there is personal salvation, and Quakers, because of their worldly associations, got swept up in this, and they were in the cities participating in the Bible societies and starting to feel that we need to sign on with these doctrinal statements that are coming out. So you had excuse me while I go behind the curtain here. So Elias Hicks was not making any friends. These are not to hand out. I didn't make multiple copies of these things, but one that I wanted to point out was, we can just pass this around for you to look at. It's called Extracts Concerning the Divinity of Our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And Meeting for Sufferings held in Philadelphia in 1823. Just pass that around so you can leaf through it, and you can see that it's just heavy on doctrine. It says it's extracts from the writings of early friends, but it doesn't particularly have footnotes saying this came from George Fox, this came from Barclay. But it's a pretty heavy theological. If you think about creeds, which we had resisted, the mainline churches had the Apostles' Creed. I believe in one God, the Father, omnipotent, and Jesus, his Son, and the Holy Spirit, and the resurrection, and the coming again, and the judging of the good and the evil. And if you look at that, it's only about 21 theological points in the Apostles' Creed. But the document here has a lot more than 21 points. And what happened as Quakerism continued to split and they continued to refine their doctrinal statements, you get to something in the 1880s called the Richmond Declaration.
Oh. Worst document ever printed.
That it's just, there's hundreds of doctrinal points, and it started in Richmond, Indiana, and it caused, this is the big 1827 split here. I believe this is the 1880s. I'm sorry, where are we? Yeah. Up in here. Anyway, it's. I just got this weekend. I've always wanted to have my own Jeffrey Kaiser chart. I finally got one, so I haven't studied it. But it's full of dense information about each of these splits and all the. We have uptographites and Beanites. So it's all explained in there. But if you look at those, as I said, that they're very heavily, and all that comes across to me when I read this is theology divides and service unites. And that was when a lot of this had spent and we get to the 1900s, the younger generations who hadn't been through these bitter splits, they wanted to work together with other Quakers, and they wanted to move toward a reconciliation. And I've told you there's 100 of doctrinal points that you'll find described here. But one interesting thing, if you want to try to summarize it, there's an event that happened in Crosswick's meeting which bubbled up into the state government involvement. There was before the split, there had been a fund raised for education. You're nodding, you know about this. Okay. So it's my stack of books sitting over here. And this is going to be hard because I don't like microphones because they tie up one of your hands. But this book is an exulting document about the Society of Friends Vindicated. This is from 1832, so this is fairly close to the time of the split. So they had this trust fund for educational purposes, and I'm not sure if there was also a building, but somebody makes a loan from this trust fund, and then the split happens. So he owes the money back to the trust fund, but now the people in control of the property are not the people he borrowed the money from. So he's reluctant to pay because maybe it was the wrong side of where he stood theologically. But I didn't mention that in terms of the Orthodox and Hicksite split, London Yearly Meeting sided with the Orthodox and did not recognize the Hicksites as a legitimate meeting. There had been a growth of evangelism in London as well, and so they chose sides, and they chose the Orthodox side. And when it went up through the courts in New Jersey having to do with this lawsuit, the courts tried to look at all the claims of the Hicksite and the Orthodox, saying we're the true Quakers, we're the original Quakers. We've got this quote from George Fox that supports us, and this quote from Barclay, and the other side would say, well, we have 3 Barclays, you're 2. And so but the courts were convinced, as London Yearly Meeting had been, that the Orthodox was the legitimate heir of Quakerism. And I just want to read this part, because it boils down the doctrinal differences that they were talking about in 1832. He says, three points. Sorry, I did not want to mark in this document from 1832, so I didn't write in the margins. Okay. He being Stacy DeCow, I think, or Joseph Hendrickson. He stated that there were 3 prominent points of doctrine on which they differed. That the ancient Society of Friends believed in the divinity of the Savior, the atonement, and in the inspiration and unerring truth and certainty of the Holy Scriptures, which tenets were still held by the Orthodox party and are and always have been deemed fundamental, but that the Hicksite party rejected these doctrines. And in the answer, says, this was Stacy DeCow answering. On the contrary, he said they had no creed and every individual member might believe in regard to them as he pleased. He refused to disclose his religious sentiments or those of his party, alleging that he was not bound to disclose them before a temporal tribunal. He contended that the Religious Society of Friends was a pure democracy, acknowledging no head but Christ, the great head of the Christian church, and that they did not consider Elias Hicks as their leader. So Elias Hicks is somebody who had gone on record as saying that the scriptures have a lot of contradictions in them, and that they are not the primary source. The light within is the primary source for inspiration. And he could find all the quotes in George Fox and Barclay he needed to support that. But those weren't his main campaigning points in terms of, he didn't come and preach about that. He preached about drifting away from the pure discipline that had developed in the 1700s that he wanted the Society of Friends to get back to. But because he was on record as opposing some of these simple doctrinal points, that was used against him as a heretic. And one of the things I've realized over the years is I've had people try to save me, is that as annoying as it can be, it can feel insulting that someone's telling you, you can't manage your own spirituality, you have to listen to me and do it this way. It can feel insulting and annoying. But generally I do pick up that the person trying to convince me of their way being better than my way is concerned about my soul. In their schema, I'm headed for a fiery eternity. And they want to save me from that. And if they didn't care, they wouldn't go to this effort. So I try to put that frame of mind and say, this is somebody in their schema, they really want to help me. So I'm loving kindness. That I'm just trying to understand that it's something I should be a little tolerant of, because they feel if they don't, they're not being true to their God. They're letting their friend fall to perdition. So anyway, why do I say that? I say that because when Hicks gets branded as this heretic, people who are strong on these few doctrinal points that they feel Hicks is trying to push, even though he wasn't, those were not his messages, but because he gets labeled with that, they see him as a real enemy. They see him as a threat to their children's salvation. So you think about that. So when we think about the Hicksite split, and you hear stories from those days about, well, the Hicksites are walking down the street here, so the Orthodox moved to the other side of the street because we can't even talk to those people, That kind of bitterness that grew up in small towns that now had 2 meeting houses. That's what that was about, I think. That it was strong worry about where their own community was headed, and that this was a real threat. So in terms of, we look at it now and say, how could you split a meeting over these doctrinal points when we're so accepting now? But in those mindsets, it was really something. The other thing is that generally, as I said, it was the wealthy urban Quaker communities that were Orthodox, and the rural, less educated, poorer communities that were more inner light is sufficient. That's not 100% general rule. You can take that generalization too far, but it does apply largely in the Philadelphia area and a few other areas. But when I've talked to other groups, they say, no, that doesn't quite match the demographic characteristics of our Hicksite and Orthodox split. So anyway, let me open it for questions. Did I cover any? Bill, you said that I had said things in the It was in our 1828 Orthodox meeting house that's on our property that came from Salem, Woodstown area. Woodstown was a rural area. They were majority Hicksite, so the Orthodox had to build a small meeting house. And that meeting house, after went into disuse, came to the East Coast and is on our property now behind our more modern building. Whoop, whoop. All right, you win. So, questions?